Hello and welcome to everybody in your virtual liminal space. My name is Howie Echohawk. I use they, them pronouns, and I am here to introduce the Indigenous Peoples Festival's last event. The Seattle Indian Health Board has put on the Indigenous People Festival. It's been 2 days. Also in the comments, let me know if you can hear me, because I hope that you can. But if you can't, then whoops. Here we are. It's day 2 of the Indigenous Peoples Festival, which is a event that is put on by the Seattle Indian Health Board. The Seattle Indian Health Board is a community health center and policy and advocacy space and many other things. It's a fantastic organization here in Seattle, which is traditional land of the Squamish, the Duwamish, the Muckleshoot, the Tulalip, the Coast Salish folks. Thank you for saying that, Mitchell. I appreciate that you can hear me. It is a good day to be here in the internet. It's a good day to be indigenous. It's good to be indigenous. Anyway, it's been a long time since I've done comedy. I'm really excited about the panel. This is the last panel for today and for the event. This is the Indigenous Creatives Native Podcaster panel, a panel that I really am excited about because I listen to all the folks' podcasts that we're about to talk to. I'm really excited to hear them interact with each other. It should be a wonderful time. Please be active in the chat. We may feature some of your questions or comments. Let us know what you think. Share the event, like the event. I'd say subscribe, but this is not YouTube. And also, please go back and look at our other events. We started out with Seattle is Native Land to the Performance, which was 6 different performing artists with drag, aerialists, a dancer, just, a lot of Native excellence and activists talking about what Seattle as Native land means to them. It's beautiful. Please look at that. We also have the concert from last night, which featured local Seattle band Ghost Horse, Superman. Everybody knows Superman. And then also it featured Quinn Christopherson, who won the 2019 Tiny Desk concert. Again, this is a Native event. We have an all-Native lineup, and we have been ecstatic about bringing it to you. We're very excited about this last thing. Before I continue, I would like to thank our sponsors. Thank you to Planned Parenthood, Friends of the Waterfront, the Seattle Foundation, ACLU Washington, and Sanka. Really appreciate Friends of Waterfront, especially for being a partner in this event. And also to the Seattle Center. The Seattle Center Festall sponsors this event every year, and we really appreciate them. Normally, this is held in person at the Seattle Center itself, and one day we look forward to be back there and doing that again. I think that will be it for me. I am going to go ahead and welcome our fantastic host of this event, Alice Quannik Glenn. Alice Quannik Glenn is from Alaska. They're Iñupiaq. She's Iñupiaq, and she hosts a podcast called Coffee and Quaq. Alice, are you here?
Yes. Hello.
Oh, hello. How are you?
Very good. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Everybody make sure that to respond in the comments and say if you can hear us or not. But Alice, I hope that you are ready and excited for this event. I'm really excited for you to take over and for me to get off screen. I'm not wearing makeup or any fancy clothes. I didn't take a shower.
None of us. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Qannik. Welcome. I am Alice Penny Glenn, Utqiaġvik. I was born and raised in Utqiaġvik, formerly known as Barrow. It's the northernmost city in the United States. And I now work full time on my podcast titled Coffee and Quaq. Coffee and Quaq is a podcast to celebrate and explore contemporary Native life in urban Alaska. And Coffee to represent our woke side, and then Quaq to represent examining our topics through an Alaska Native lens. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to introduce our guests we have here today. First is Tommy Teebs Pico, who is a poet, podcaster, and TV writer. Welcome, Tommy. Will you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, hi, my name is Tommy Teebs Pico. I'm a Kumeyaay podcaster and poet and, writer for screen and television, etc. I have two podcasts currently, one called Food for Thot. That's food, the number 4, and thought spelled THOT. It's for gay sluts who love to read. Multiracial mix of queer writers to talk about, pop culture and sex and Beyonce and butt stuff. And we're on iHeartRadio. And then my other podcast is called Scream Queen, a podcast about scary movies from people not typically depicted in scary movies. Me and my friend, co-host Drea Washington, examine horror from a queer, Black and Indigenous lens, and have a really good time doing it. And each week we nominate a final girl of color as our Scream Queen of the week. And then for a while I was hosting a podcast called Junk. It was a companion podcast to my third book, which came out a couple of years ago. It was an interview show wherein I'd go into the homes of 3 different people and they would tell me a story about an item of junk in their house, kind of like show and tell style. I started podcasting in 2016, but I always wanted to, but when I was a kid, before I could write or anything like that, I had a tape recorder and I always talked into it and I would interview my stuffed animals. I would make my G.I. Joes and my Barbies fight and stuff like that. So I always kind of use my voice as the engine or the medium of my creativity. And I'm glad to be able to be on this panel with y'all and to continue talking about all that kind of stuff.
Yay! Thank you so much. Wow, I didn't even know the extent of all of the work that you did. That's so exciting. Thank you for sharing. And our next guest is Rebecca Nagle. Rebecca Nagle is an award-winning advocate and writer and citizen of the Cherokee Nation. Welcome, Rebecca. Will you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work?
Yeah, for sure. Oceanagar, Gohin, Daldon, Telek, Oklahoma, Janelle, Joplin, Missouri, Otesadola. Jaleka Yet Gala. My name is Rebecca Nagle. I'm a citizen of Cherokee Nation. I live here in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and I grew up in Joplin, Missouri. And I am a freelance writer and also the writer and the host of the serial podcast This Land. So we had a first season that came out in the summer of 2019, and it was covering a Supreme Court case called, it was originally called Murphy and then called McGirt, about the reservation status of Muskogee Creek Nation that had a big impact on treaty and indigenous land rights here in Oklahoma, and I would argue nationally. And we're in the middle of working on a season 2, which is super exciting. So yeah, I'm super stoked to be part of this festival and also just in conversation with you guys. I'm really excited.
Okay, so before we get into our questions that we composed the other day, I wanted to do some quick rapid fire questions for you guys so that we can get to know what kind of native you are. So I'll just fire them off and then you guys just answer, okay? So the first is Apple or Android?
Apple.
Apple.
Fish or game?
Ooh, game.
Rebecca, what did you?
Game.
Okay, you're like, yeah, yes, game. And then the last one is Kool-Aid or Tang?
Kool-Aid.
Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
I would always have that red Kool-Aid cup mustache right there.
Yeah, I would even get it above my nose here too. Okay, so thank you for introducing yourselves. I appreciate it. I want to know a little bit more. And so I've been asked this question so many times before, and it was, how did I get started on, my podcast? And the answer kind of changes and like varies from person to person, but I wanted to ask you both, how did you guys get started?
Before I was a writer, I was actually doing more community organizing and activism. And so I was doing a lot of work around sexual assault and domestic violence. And sometimes in those campaigns to try and like bring awareness to an issue, I would write an op-ed or write a piece. And then when I left that work, I came and did like a language program with my tribe for a couple of years. And then I was like, well, on the side, like this, I'll try out like this writing thing and see how it goes. And then I got more into journalism and freelance writing. And that grew into podcasting. And so the first season of This Land was the first time I'd ever worked in audio. And so I would say the learning curve was really steep. Like, I think the first versions of episodes were really great essays and horrible to listen to. And so, but yeah, it's also really exciting. I think the format, there's a way that it's really intimate, like when you're almost having a conversation directly with the listener. And I also think that so much of my other writing exists online, where I think it's very temporary. People usually spend a short amount of time with those written pieces. And so it was nice to be able to cover a topic with like a lot more time and breath. Yeah, so it just kind of happened to fall into it, I guess.
Cool. Tommy?
I was just a really big fan of podcasts. I just started off in fandom. And so I listened to, because this one summer I started I lived in Brooklyn at the time, and I started going to the beach in the Far Rockaways a lot. And so that was about an hour's worth of train ride. And I didn't want to listen to my music because that's what I listened to when I ran, and I didn't want to play it out. So I really got into podcasts, and I would listen to like interview podcasts like Fresh Air or Mark Maron or Aisha Tyler's podcast, and then I liked like the pop culture happy hour and Pop Rocket and Las Culturistas. And so I was listening to lots of different stuff, as well as like Metzi in Space and Red Man Laughing. And I was just kind of like awash, and I subscribed to like 15 or 20 podcasts, and I listen to them all every single week, continue to. It's like my medium. Like it's great when you're cooking or cleaning and you don't want to have to look at a screen, but you still want something to be around you and entertain you and enrich you and in some way inform you and something else. And I love listening to, and like the read and stuff like that, where it's like I'm getting to know things so I don't have to actually go through the headlines. You know what I mean? Like I can actually learn everything I need from this one source and through these particularly charismatic people and through this relationship. And I had gone to this writing conference, the Tin House Summer Writers Workshop in 2016. And I met 3 other people there, and we kind of fell in really nicely. And I started to realize that our discussion, they were all queer, and then also all lived in New York as well, but we'd never really met each other. And like, I'm Native, and like Fana's Latinx, and Dennis is Black, and Joe is white. And so it was like from like all these different perspectives, and also like the fact that we inhabited different gay spaces in New York without ever overlapping over each other. So we all had, so it was just interesting to come together with all these different perspectives and all these different backgrounds, but then also like we were interested in discussing the same exact things, which was Beyonce and getting it up the butt. You know what I mean? So it was like, there was a definite, and also like books. And so all of those 3 things, our intellectual lives, our sex lives, and our pop culture lives, but intersected in a really nice way. And there wasn't anything really like it. And I knew that, when you make friends and you make them like at camp or something like that, and you always say like, oh, let's hang out when we get back home. And it like never really works out. And I wanted to continue having discussions with these people. And the way I knew I could make it happen, them all being New Yorkers as well, is if I turned it into work, because everyone there isn't a workaholic. So I was like, no, what if we made a podcast where we got together every Sunday and we talked to each other and we had a topic like consent or gay bars or whatever. We had like an overall topic, and then we just filter our discussion through that lens. And it started out as a labor of love. Like I knew that like having recorded audio often for audiobooks or through performances and stuff like that, I knew that there would be, like Rebecca said, like a learning curve. So we did like dummy episodes in Joe's apartment, in one of the co-hosts' apartment. And we did that every week for like a month. So like we need to get comfortable with each other, because having conversations is not the same as having mic'd conversations, you know, like when you're in the studio or when you're in front of the mic, like something changes and there's a more of an awareness of people listening to you. So we have to get to the point where we don't realize there's a mic in front of us anymore, you know, so that the conversation can be as improvisational as it would be if we were just talking in front of each other. And I had a friend who had a studio in Greenpoint, and he gave us friends and family rate. So we were able to record in this really state-of-the-art studio with an engineer for like $25 an hour, just because I knew this person. And then Fran knew a photographer who took all of our pictures and like all our headshots for our website. And then somebody else knew like a graphic designer, and they did all of the branding. And we had an 8-episode fully funded or self-funded and produced first season that was then picked up by Grindr. And Grindr then, every time we had an episode come out on Sundays, they sent a push notification to all of its 48, 69 million subscribers or whatever. And then from that, we got on a network called Forever Dog. And then we were bought by iHeartRadio, which is where we currently reside.
Wow, that's a wild story. Yeah. I asked that question because I grew up, in the village, and I never really knew that this was an avenue, a career choice, really, and so I went to school for aerospace, and then I came back, I was living in Daytona Beach, Florida, and Arizona for a while. And I came back to Alaska and I was so excited to be around people that knew me, and I didn't have to explain myself. I was so excited to be around family, friends, food, things that were so familiar. But I was still seeing this lack of representation of Native people in my home state, and so I would go to my sister's Christmas party or whatever, and there's just all these Native ladies fighting over these, that present game. It's White Elephant or something like that. And it's just so funny. They're so hilarious, the people that I know. And here I am just reading news stories about Native disparity, the disparities of our communities in the news. And I'm just what the heck, I wanted to see more of my older sister and aunties, Native aunties, in media. And so I just decided to create it myself. And so how has, your upbringing and your community influenced the work that you do today?
Yeah, definitely. I think, when you were talking, I was thinking about explaining to people here in Oklahoma that I was working on a podcast, and there were I would be oh, it's like the radio, but it's online. And it would sort of almost get this sort of oh, that's really cute. Why isn't it on the radio? We're sorry you didn't get on the radio. But yeah, I think that I think for me, my motivation as a storyteller is just, I lived on the East Coast for a while, which made me feel really, really invisible, and made me realize just how little representation there is of Native people, and just sort of the ignorance and kind of the very, very basic lack of understanding that people kind of enter these conversations with was something that I was encountering in my day-to-day life. And then kind of exactly what you said about just not seeing our stories told in the media or in the press. And so, yeah, I think a lot about, when I go out and I interview people about the responsibility of carrying and holding those stories, and representing people in a way that's holistic. Yeah. And so I guess I think a lot about it in terms of kind of the people whose stories I feel responsible for, and how to do justice to that. But yeah, I think one of the things that I really like about where I live is that people keep you really humble. And so it was, it's definitely a lot of explaining what a podcast was when I first started to get into it.
Yeah. Tommy?
Well, here's the thing. When I was growing up, you know how like in Indian country sometimes like you're like either like your most obvious flaw or the thing that sticks up about you becomes your nickname. Well, like my nickname was Loud Face because I had a loud motherfucking face. So like I think it's just like a natural evolution of what I always was kind of doing. Like my parents would say that when I was at the bus stop, like the other kids would be like around me because I would be telling a story. And you know, like when you come from a place where people are continually telling stories, and storytelling is a medium not only of a story, but also of language and of affection and of care and all those kinds of things. You know, I started to put that out into the world. That's what I wanted to do. That's what I wanted to do with my voice. And also I wanted to be somebody unflinchingly contemporary, because I was tired of our depictions being of people based in the past and period pieces and stuff like that. And also nobody knows how fucking funny we are, god damn it. Like like what you were saying about like trauma porn in the news and stuff like that. Like I didn't want to be a statistic, but I also like didn't want to be flippant. You know, I wanted to because I think when you come from a place that where it's like growing up there is very hard, and you develop a sense of humor as like a coping mechanism, you know, it's with the gravity. It's not necessarily like we need levity because of the gravity of our situations in our lives, but also not to be too like I didn't want to sit too much in that. And I had been so scared when I left the res, because like I left when I was 18 and to go to school in New York, and I was terrified because I didn't know anybody who left really, and I was terrified that I would go out into the world and the world would make me less native. But what I realized as an adult and as a person who pays their own bills and like and like is making media and making stuff and writing books and doing podcasts, I'm actually making the world more Kumeyaay. I'm infusing more Kumeyaay culture into the world, because if I create culture and I'm a Kumeyaay person, I'm creating Kumeyaay culture. And that is like the elasticity of our identities and of our cultural footprint, I guess.
Yeah, that's so cool. I think that it was like a natural progression for me as an Iñupiaq woman, because, you know, as Native people, we just know so many great storytellers, right? And so for me, I was always listening to my dad and my older sister. They're really funny, really great storytellers. And so like my, I guess, like superpower I felt like was listening, you know? And so, and then traditionally we didn't have a written language, right? So it, like the most natural thing for me and in terms of like what to create for a podcast and doing interviews with other Native people is just to talk. Let people have the mic and let them speak, you know, and tell their own story in their own way. And then all of that like light and love shines through in their which is really cool. But yeah, so I think that, so I have like, you know, Coffee and Quaq is kind of like my morning podcast. You know, it's like it's kind of easy listening to, and it's like you just learn a lot, right? And but what I want to do next is to do kind of like a fun podcast, you know, and this is why I'm really excited to talk to you specifically, Tommy. And it's a little bit like celebrating Native joy and just like not taking ourselves seriously and not explaining anything, you know, like just really having a good time. We want to call it cocktails and cop, and I want to do it. Cop is the Inca word for weed in my language, and so we want to just like have like these really unfiltered like after hours kinds of discussions. But what I was finding is that I was feeling really stifled because it felt like there was a lot of responsibility to not be so how do I explain that? Just like not so, I guess, R-rated, you know, because I'm holding like as an Iñupiaq woman, I'm holding my community with me, and so like to represent them well, you know, it has to be. I don't know. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? Like, do you ever feel the weight of your community, and how does that play out in the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I think about kind of in everything that I put out in the world. And so I think that, I mean, I think one is that we just need more Native people everywhere, you know, in podcasting, you know, I think the TV show you're working on, Tommy, is so exciting. Like, we need more Native stories in all aspects of media culture. And I think when there's so I think because the erasure of Indigenous people is so pervasive in our society, when you have a piece of visibility, I think that there is an enormous amount of pressure to like use that piece of visibility well. And so like I felt a lot of pressure with the podcast for it to be successful, for it to do a good job, to kind of like prove that this type of story is something that people are interested in. Because, you know, I feel like sometimes we're told, you know, I'm told all the time by editors that, you know, the story I want to tell about my community isn't, you know, quote unquote newsworthy. And so, yeah. And I think that there's I guess I'm trying to navigate ways also to like, to push back on that, and to, you know, refocus kind of on like what are the stories and what are the things that are most important to me, or really what do I want to prioritize. But yeah, I think um you know, I think that pressure is really real, and it exists within that broader context of, you know, most Indigenous stories are erased. You know, we're not being represented in podcasting, on the radio, you know, on NPR, like on in all of these things. And so, you know, when you get kind of like a break in that wall of invisibility, it feels like you have to kind of, or at least I feel the pressure to like make the most of it. And I think too, it's like, I think just working in those things, I mean, I'm sure you guys have stories like these too, but there's just so many times that, you know, on top of just like the pressure of writing and trying to get things, you know, a good story and all those things, is sort of like working in spaces where a lot of times you're working with a lot of folks who are non-native, and then there's like that work of educating people on top of the work of just like getting the thing done. And so I find that a lot in like in working with editors, like at different staff, like because I work with editors in like different places, where it's like there's a lot of labor in just like explaining things to people, and it can be like super exhausting. It can be really, really tiring. And so yeah, and so I think, I don't know, I think I lean a lot on like other Native journalists. Like I have like friends that I call up to be like, oh my God, can you believe blah 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 blah. But I think that, you know, I think a lot about how do we push forward into these spaces like together, and like how do we, you know, support each other's work so that we like expand just kind of like what the terrain of Native media looks like. And I actually think that like as much as I talk about like what's missing, I actually think that we're in this like really exciting moment of like Native podcasts are exploding. Like there are a lot more, it feels like there are a lot more Native journalists than there were even like 3 or 4 years ago. And I think we're kind of in this new era of there being more like Native written TV shows, like more Native books on bookshelves. And so, you know, I think that things are changing, and that finally we're getting a little bit more visibility. But I do think that it's something that is really unique to being an Indigenous creative person, because it's not like we're working in a world where there's like a lot of representation of Native people. And so it's like when there is that moment of visibility, a lot of times it's like the only thing that non-Native people are interacting with. And so, yeah. And so I think that pressure is real. And then I also think that we have to like push back on it, sort of like, you know, like, this is not, you know, this is not the representation of like every Native person. Like Indian country is really diverse. And so I think that the way that sort of media climate creates, like, I think this environment where they try and treat like one Native story as a stand-in for everything. You know, I'm constantly getting emails about like random stuff where it's like, oh, can you talk about this or that? And I'm like, no, I can't really, because I'm not, you know, Lakota, or like that area isn't my expertise, but here's like somebody that would be really great to talk to. And so, yeah, I think that, you know, I think pushing back on kind of the way that works too is something that I think about. But yeah, and I think that I think that one of the big reasons that I care a lot and think a lot about the power of storytelling is because I think of invisibility as a system of racism, like as a function of anti-Indigenous racism is like that erasure. And so I think whenever we're out there and we're telling stories, and they're authentic and they're from an Indigenous perspective, that we're pushing back against that. So yeah, but that doesn't mean that's easy.
It almost feels like it's our gift, it's our curse, right?
Yeah.
Tommy?
And the challenge of representation and authenticity, and how we can be some of the most judgmental of people who are creating, of our own people. We can be so judgmental of them.
Yeah.
Are they authentically representing us or their community? And I just always say, look, as a queer person from the Viejas the Kumeyaay Nation, who moved to New York when they were 18 and back to California when they were 35, this is what it is for me. But I'm not out here being like, I'm making broad claims about Indigenous people. Like it just the way I try to get out of the burden, or feeling the burden of representation, is doing work to create exquisite moments, and something that is true or honest or beautiful or something, that like, if I can articulate something really, really, really individual in particular, like that's how I get out of feeling the need to represent everybody. Because if I thought about that all the time, I would just make really washed out milk toast work, I feel like. And when I recenter, and this is because, like, coming from the poetry world and writing and developing a practice of writing, one wherein I had to be alone, I started trying to imagine the world alone and without the expectations or the other voices of other people over my shoulder, because if I listened too much to them, I would never make anything. And yet, like, it's like, but then once we do make it and put it out, then it's like this other scrutiny from non-natives and scrutiny from native people. And it can be really frustrating, but I try as much as I can, as much as I possibly can, while accepting like valid and legitimate criticism, to also remind myself that other people's opinion of me is none of my business.
Mm-hmm.
And it has nothing, usually 9 times out of 10, has nothing to do with me. They're hearing it or receiving it in a way that, like, when you put stuff out there, sometimes people can, in very generous and in very destructive ways, misinterpret what it is that you're doing. And when it's in a really generous way, that you see something about what you made from a different perspective, and that can be really beautiful. And in more destructive ways, it's like, I'm not the one who hurt you. Like, I am not the one who hurt you, and I cannot take responsibility for your pain. But I can still listen sometimes,
Yeah, that's funny that you said that, because I just literally tweeted that like 2 days ago. Like, it's none of my business what people like think about me and the decisions that I make. And it makes so much sense, and I think that when I first started my podcast, people were contacting me left and right to do and speak on everything Native. Like, they're like, oh, she's a podcaster. She's, her information is so accessible. She's accessible to us. So let's just contact her and put her here, even though like that's not what I specialize in. You know what I mean? Like, that's not, I'm not an expert in some of these things, but I'm like, but if you'll pay me, I can be an expert in anything. You know what I mean?
But I think when you're talking about the opportunities and the excitement about the current moment, when Rebecca was talking about like all these journalists and podcasters, and the great thing about that is, if I get approached to do something that is not my lane, I like, actually, I can't do that, but I know somebody Biloxi over here who could potentially do this for you, or like, that's not my community, so I can't consult on something. Even though I lived in New York, I'm not Shinnecock, so I can't consult on that project, but I know somebody who is, and that's like one of the best things about visibility. And I think about our generation is that none of us are interested in being the one. We're interested in calling people together, and I think sharing. It's been my experience anyway of like sharing resources and broadening community and pulling people up with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like that's been my experience. Like, I remember like when I was first starting writing, and there's still people that I call, but like when I was doing my like first pitches and like I didn't really know what I was doing, like Mark Trehant at like Indian Country Today was like one of the first editors I ever worked with, and I just feel like people really gave me like a leg up, whether it was like an opportunity, and often it was even just like advice, like when I was learning how to do things. And so, yeah, I think that that's one thing that I think maybe is different about Native writers. Cause like I always think about like my personal success, like as connected to like I want to see all Native journalists succeed, right? And I'm like angry at outlets that don't like include our stories or don't like employ our talent, you know. And then like on the opposite side of that anger, I'm really like happy and like ecstatic, you know. I feel like all of Indian country just like cheers whenever there's you know, even like I remember like when the chief of Muskogee Creek Nation was like named one of the like times 100 people, like everyone was so excited. And so I think that there's like kind of pressure in that, because I think I feel like I feel like tied into this collective and like everything that I do. And then at the same time, it's also like amazing and beautiful, and like there's this network of support. And so yeah, but I definitely think about like the success of the whole of like, okay, where are we at with like Indigenous journalism and storytelling, and like where do we need to get to so that it's equitable, and like, and not even just like equitable, like, you know, I hate talking about like Indigenous representation in journalism as like a diversity issue, where it's just like, it's actually just like journalism. Like if you're not covering it, or if you're not covering it timely, or you're not covering our communities accurately, and you're a legacy journalism institution, you don't have a diversity problem, you have a journalism problem. Like you're not doing your job. And I think collectively about like where, as like a group of writers and as a community, like where are we trying to get to, and like how can I add to that? Yeah, but then that it can feel like a lot, but it can also feel really exciting. And so
Yeah, I think that, you know, in some ways I feel a little bit like inhibited, or that it kind of affects my creativity to hold the weight of my entire community. I mean, I'm inspired by community, you know what I mean? I love it. That's the thing that gives me inspiration, but I also do feel like sometimes it can be so overwhelmingly heavy to carry, and it could be stifling at times, just to be like, okay, well, I need to represent Iñupiaq people in a certain way. But you know, I think that I'm slowly trying to make attempts outside of that to just like push it a little bit further, to be more creative, to be more rather than saying that I'm a representative of like my community, I'm just representing myself, you know, and that's in all its complexities and nuances and beautiful things and terrible things about me, and just like being my true authentic self and bringing that forward.
And like that as a challenge is one that affects our community differently, you know, and in a very particular way. And we were talking before about being like, ooh, I don't know if I want to make something fun and like rated R, but then like, how is that going to reflect on the people who I came up with, you know, or that kind of thing. And it's like, man, the amount of dick jokes I make on Twitter, Instagram, any given day, like at a certain point, it was like, it's fun. And there are people where I come from who are like, not in like a perverted way, but who are, they're lewd people. They will make like dick and pussy jokes all day too. But all of a sudden, if I'm doing it on the air, then it's a problem. And it's like, no, I'm not even, I am a tame person by some people's standards. You know what I mean? Like, so it's like, it's the idea of it being out there. And I think a part of the trepidation that people have in that type of representation is we're talking about people who've had a lot of times huge parts of their culture stripped away intentionally and been made to feel ashamed for that part of themselves. And I sometimes wonder if it isn't a fear of having, if getting excited about something is a precursor to it being taken away again, that like, cause at least I do in the Kumeyaay Nation, we have such so much of our language and our traditions and our ceremonies are gone because of the boarding school system. And my mother didn't pass on the language or any of that stuff to my father. And I think it was because she was afraid that if she did, it would be taken away from him as violently as it was taken away from her. And in that way, it was an act of care towards her son. And I live with the specter of that fear and that shame all the time. But I'm trying as much as I can to put myself on mic or on stage or in the book or in the TV writer's room, because I'm not going to do white supremacy's job for it. Like, I'm not going to erase myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so cool. That's so inspiring. You know what I mean? Knowing that white people consume your media, like, how does that affect what you guys do? Does it affect what you do, or what?
Yeah, it does. I feel like I remember this one conversation when we, I can't remember where we were at in production. I think we were still at storyboarding, and like one of the people that was working on the podcast, they were like, well, we have to decide if this is for like a non-native audience or a native audience. And I was like, it's for both. Like, and if it's not for both, like, I'm out of here, you know? And so I think like, I think a lot about like what needs to be explained and what doesn't need to be explained. And so a lot of times, like, I don't like explaining cultural things, but like I'll explain the how out of like federal Indian policy and like what is tribal sovereignty. And like that's the lesson like I will give. And then when it comes to like our cultural practices, like maybe like you'll get tastes of that or like hints of that. Like I wrote this one essay, and one of the, I think it was like in copy editing or something, I was talking about like during removal, how like people move their council fires, and people were like, well, what is a council fire? And I was like, I'm actually like, I don't want to, if the audience doesn't understand what that is, that's actually okay. And it's actually a really complicated thing to explain. But I think editors always have that. And then I think on the flip side of that, for me, when I write stuff, it's really important that like when like with the podcast This Land, that like native folks from Oklahoma, or if I'm writing like a piece about language, that like the speakers that I talk to, that like when they read it or when they see it, that it resonates with them as well. And so I think that both are achievable, and I think it's a fine line to walk, because I think that there's like educating people, and then there's like doing that work of translation. And I think for me, it's just like I think about like what people need to know, and I think people need to know about like what their government did, like the promises that their government made, like the obligation that they have as U.S. citizens to live up to those promises. But oftentimes I think that those audiences can be hungry for things of our culture, or like more like intimate details that I feel like doesn't belong to them. And so I try to think critically about like what's like okay for people to just like not know and not understand. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like, you provide like a skeleton, and that's enough sometimes. And then, yeah.
But there is the like reality of like when you put something out into the world, you don't have control over it anymore, So like anybody could be your audience, and that has to be a part of the, I think, prep of getting ready to release something. Is this like, it's yours up until the point where you let it go, and then it's not yours anymore. And that's like any project, right? And that's respective of any audience. And also the experience of audience isn't necessarily the same as the experience of an editor, right? So like sometimes editors will want you to explain things, and you're like, I fully believe in the audience's ability to go to Google, which is open 24 hours a day, and figure this out, But there was times that I've just had to like take an L and be like, okay, so I just write Indian, and then they have to like in a parentheses say Indian. And it's like, Google, like, it's just, I refuse to do that in my work, but sometimes I don't have control over what my press puts out, and they have a different audience in mind that I do. I always imagine like my brother, I just think about, I've always wanted to write and in a way, like, especially in the poetry world, that like people who didn't go to school for this could still read it. That like, because my parents loved poetry, but they never went to school for it. They just had the books in the house. And also like there's this ivory tower way of looking at poetry that is like, people, you have to learn this in school, or there's like, you have to go through an MFA program, or all of these ways in which like poetry becomes very estranged from the day-to-day. And I wanted my work to embrace the day-to-day as much as possible, because like the people where I came from, they didn't go to school for this, and I still want them to be able to enjoy it, and I still want them to hold it as like an artifact of the Viejas res, of Kumeyaay culture. Because like the thing is, we have these things called the bird songs, and the bird songs are like these really long song cycles. And I realized that my pull towards book-length poems was because I grew up listening to bird songs. My dad was a bird singer, and that like in a way I was composing the first new bird songs in like 150 years. And that like people wanted to tie my lineage to Walt Whitman or Anne Carson or epic American poets, and it was like, no, it's the bird songs. Like that is my cultural that's the tradition that I'm drawing on, while innovating it for like a new audience and with other different authors and readers in mind.
I think that I struggle because like, a huge mission of mine is to provide accurate and authentic representation in media. Like that's just a big goal of mine. But then I struggle with that too, because I'm like, well, what does that mean to like share so much of ourselves and then have it be exploited in ways, because there's just a history of exploitation on Native people. You know what I mean? Like everything from like museums to even stories. So like recently there was this story in the news about a young whaler from Savunga, an island here, who caught a whale for his community. And right. And like, it's such a proud moment, but he was like receiving death threats, and like environmental were like, coming for him. And it's just like, well, how much do you share? And how much do you keep to yourself? It's like, I want to see myself in the media that I consume, but I also like, it's almost like, do I want to tell them where the berry patch is? Are they going to come and take all the berries? And I don't know. I feel like I struggle with that internally all the time. Is like, how much do I really want to share? And then how much do we just keep for ourselves?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think yeah, I think about that a lot. Like it's funny, like being Cherokee, because there's this way that our identity is constantly appropriated. Like, when somebody thinks that they're Native, they almost always think that they're Cherokee. But like, you don't see white people trying to like stomp dance or like get wild onions or like make nutchi. Like all of these aspects of our culture like really don't exist outside of Cherokee communities, or there's not like a broader awareness. And so there's this way where I feel like we are constantly fighting this onslaught of appropriation of our identity, and then our culture is like not the thing that you see in like gift shops by the side of the road. And so yeah, it's like I think about that a lot too. Like I've done a couple pieces trying to incorporate like Indigenous language and like talk to like go out and talk to like our first language speakers. And yeah, and think about like one thing we did with the podcast was my friend John Ross, we sat down and we interviewed him. And so we did like big chunks of the segment were in Cherokee. And then it was kind of this interesting thing where like he translated himself because, he's obviously like bilingual. And so it was like his voice in Cherokee and his voice in English. And then there were some things that we left like just in Cherokee that were kind of like like little treats for like the like very small number of people who understand Cherokee who listen to the podcast. But yeah, and I remember like one of the moments, like, and when I was interviewing him, he was like, he was talking in English about like how he couldn't explain something, and then just switched to Cherokee to like explain what he was thinking about. And like we just sort of like left that moment there, just because I think, and speakers will say this a lot, where the sort of depth of what they can express. And I'm just learning Cherokee. I'm not, I'm so early in my language learning journey. But it is like a really different worldview. And I think like the depth of what people can express in English and in Cherokee, it's like I even see like when people try to translate stuff from like our language to English, like when people try to take an English phrase and say it in Cherokee, like good morning or something like that, like you could say Osta Sonale, but it like makes no damn sense. Like it's just not how our language works. And so I think there's a lot that gets lost in translation. And I think that there's like some stuff that just like doesn't need to be translated, or like doesn't make sense when it's translated. So yeah, so but I think that it's hard because I think that, again, like I always think about like, what is the response? Like if I'm talking to a non-native audience, like what is their responsibility? And it's like, it's not their responsibility to like, like practice these ceremonies and know these things, but it is their responsibility to understand their government's like treaty obligation to my tribe. And it is their responsibility to like understand what sovereignty is in like a 2020 kind of civics way, when people don't even have that like baseline of understanding. And so it's like, those things are like things that I feel like can be explained. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. It makes sense.
I'm coming at this like from a kind of a different angle because because of the mission system, and this happens to a lot of Southern California tribes. I don't even have the tradition knowledge that could be exploited. Like I don't know where the berry patch is either, because that died when my grandmother died. However I get to that berry patch, I don't know. So in the wake of the devastation of cultural knowledge loss, that's why I feel so compelled to barrel in to the present and into pop culture and into literature and into TV and all that kind of stuff, because that's how I'm like, I feel my personal responsibility is to create new traditional knowledge because of of how much was like stolen or erased intentionally and taken away. And so, yeah, I theorize about what creator's name was, and because the things that I have to go on, the things that were the same for me, that was the same for my grandmother and the generations before that, is the sky. That's the only thing that's the same, or like maybe some of the plants or whatever. So it's like, I'm trying to intuit the world through my body and my brain and my perspective and my upbringing and the place that I came from and the mountains around the valley where I was born. We weren't removed, like Kumeyaay people, my tribe, we're in the same place that we always been. And so it's like, I'm still trying to, when I go back, or just being here now, I mean, right now I'm in Los Angeles, which isn't that far from where I was raised. It's like, there's something about the quality of or just like the level of humidity or the change of the seasons, or like things that I try to pay attention to as a person who is ancestrally from here, but like doesn't have a way of doesn't know the words for anything anymore. And I think there's a part of wonder that I try to come from, like a perspective of wonder that I try to carry with me, and like to just, because like Kumeyaay people existed on the coast, and they existed in the foothills and in the mountains and the deserts. And so, sometimes if I'm at the ocean, this is going to sound a little woo-woo or a little bit corny or whatever, but sometimes it happens when I just like look out into the waves and I think like, what would they have thought that was? Or how would they have named this? And it's like, I don't have an answer. And that's the frustrating part of it, because I feel like so incredibly close to an answer and so incredibly far away that I just, for me, it's like asking the right questions.
Yeah. I think that I feel the same way. And I don't think it's corny what you just said, because I I live and work here in Anchorage on Denina land now, but I just came back from a trip to Nome, which is Iñupiaq land, and I had like a wild spiritual awakening in Nome, and that's never happened to me before. I'm very like, I'm not spiritual, religious. I've never been. I'm like overthinking things all the time. I'm like, very cerebral and like intellectualize everything in my life. But I went to Nome, and I don't know if it had been just like this year, quarantine and like social distancing or whatever, but I went to Iñupiaq land, and I was just totally taken by Nome. I'd never been to Nome before, but it was so familiar yet so foreign. It's like it's Iñupiaq land, but it's totally different from where I'm from. And where I'm from, I was like totally disoriented because north is towards the ocean, and then in Nome, south is towards the ocean. So I was just like, this is so crazy because like I feel like I'm at home, but it's just totally different. Like there's mountains in Nome, and there's no mountains in, northern Alaska. It's flat tundra as far as you can see, but here in Nome, like there's these beautiful mountains, and it's like supposed by like the ocean. And then I was there for a really difficult reason. I was there to interview women about their experiences with sexual assault and kind of like the systematic issues with that and what's going on. And so all of these things, like all of these, like this cauldron of emotions had just like washed over me. And I was like in Iñupiaq land, but it's like a historically racist place, because of the history of like gold mining and like, and then they had to force Iñupiaq people to live in that area to go to school, and like just like this intense history, right? And then as I was like running, and I'm not like a runner, but I was like going for runs because I wanted to see Nome for what it was, and like just be close beyond the land. I just wanted to experience it all. It was just like very open. And I was like running on the beach, and as I was running, I felt like my feet were stirring up like spirits on the beach, and for me, going to the ocean is just very therapeutic, like you were talking about, like it's just something that for me, it just feels like it's so big and vast that, anything going on in my head is never going to be as big as the ocean. It's never going to matter that much because this is just so much, it's so much before me. But as I was like running on the beach, I could just feel like all of these spirits like channeling through me, some really angry ones and some really like open ones and like inspiring and beautiful ones too, like very comforting and nourishing and like at peace with the world, but also very like this history of, sexual assault and trauma and all that kind of stuff. Like it was just like feeling really heavy. And yeah, so I mean, I just like, I'm sorry I had to mention it because I'm just coming off of it. Like I just got back like 2 weeks ago, and it's like totally life-changing for me because I'm not spiritual and I'm not like religious or anything like that, but it was like going home. And there's origin stories of Iñupiaq people like that come from the mountains over there. And so I was just like, holy cow, like I'm coming home, and but yeah, I mean, I think that there's a level of trauma-informed work that we do, right? I think that's just inherent in our creative selves as Native people, just because of the history that we've all, experienced. So I kind of wanted to ask you guys about, what do you guys feel about this idea of like trauma-informed work, and how does that play out in the work that you do?
Yeah, that's a big question. So like I kind of said before I was a writer or a journalist, I was doing advocacy work around sexual assault and domestic violence. And I was doing that work because like as from my own personal experiences, like I think just to like heal and like feel like I could move through like what had happened to me when I was a kid, like I needed to like be able to like do something with it or like create something like greater than like the trauma that like I had survived. And so I did work that was kind of like art based around like creating like just like honestly just like collecting survivor stories. And so I did a lot of like traveling and working with communities like in different parts of the country on like collecting those stories and like finding ways for people. It was kind of like with the thinking, like I think a lot of times any trauma, I think especially sexual assault, and violence like that. But I think any kind of trauma, like we are made to like carry it alone, or we're told that to carry it alone. And so like when, you know, I feel like a lot of time as a survivor, I was told like that, like I was broken and it was like my work to like put my broken self back together. And I think, and as an adult, I got to this place where I'm like, no, like actually, like I am not what's broken. Like what's broken is the system where like every other Native woman that I know has a similar story, and that like this is actually like really, really common. And so it's interesting because like I came into writing almost kind of like from needing a break from that work, because it was like it was like it was hard to be like interacting with those stories like day in and day out, although it was like also very healing for me at the same time. I think a lot of people who work in that space like go through that cycle. And yeah, and so I think about it a lot. I mean, I really like doing stories that like kind of like what you guys were talking about before, that are just about like contemporary Indigenous people doing badass stuff that's not about trauma and hardship and things like that. And I think it's really important, even when there is content about you know, like oppression, or even when we're talking about trauma, like I think just like kind of how I had that own like personal experience in within myself of understanding like what happened to me as being part of a system, where instead of sort of doing the like poverty porn thing that I think we see a lot of people do in Indigenous communities, is talk about like the systems, but then also talk about like the resilience. So like I think like I did a couple stories about like COVID, and you know, I think there's been some good coverage about what's happening in Indian country with COVID, and some coverage that's not. But like one of the things that I feel like hasn't been covered enough is like how a lot of tribes are like at the forefront of fighting it. Like my tribe is doing way more contact tracing than the state of Oklahoma. Like we have drive-through testing throughout our reservation here. Like I can go and get, I mean, I went and got tested when I was exposed recently, and like, and you can't like the health department here in the county is not staying on top of it the way that the tribe is. And so I think within, you know, within those inequities, there's like the system to talk about, and also like that resilience. And so I think about that a lot, and how I tell stories about like, and I think like, because a lot of times like when I would work with survivors, like the part of their story that they didn't want to tell was like the story of the trauma. Like for them, a lot of times it was about like their healing journey, that like that was the part that they wanted to share. And so I think that I think about that a lot, about also like when dealing with trauma, is like what is the thing that either like the person or the community wants to share. But yeah, I mean, I think that I think that it's also, there's a way that it's like unavoidable, like, and there are things like I even just think about like language, and like kind of like that one podcast episode that I was talking about, but it's just like we're in the middle of losing our language right now, you know, like our last generation of like we're losing our last generation of speakers like right now, you know, and like that's traumatic. Like it's just this huge loss, sorry. And like that's happening right now, but it's really important that we talk about it and that people understand what's going on. But even just like talking about that reality, like it's such an intense loss. Yeah, so yeah, but I guess just to like put a like in cap on it or whatever, I think the most important thing is, I think, to not fall into like the tropes of how our communities are like always covered, is to talk about like the systems that have created these things, like the laws and the systems, and also really to point out like the resilience, you know. And you know, I think about that a lot when I cover tribal governments. Like I think that we're all like, our tribal governments are always like treated as inferior. And again, here in Oklahoma, it's like we're doing a lot of the basic function of government that like our broke state is not doing, you know, like we're paving roads, we're making sure that rural communities have running water. And so it's like, we're not just this sort of like sad story. Like there's so much more to it that I think is like really important to tell.
Yeah, thank you for sharing.
Trauma, it's almost like, well, what else are you gonna do? I mean, in the work that I've done, haven't necessarily I'm not a journalist, and so my work hasn't really been outwardly about incorporating or investigating and in uncovering and publishing like other people's relationships to their traumas and stuff. It's mostly been like, what is my relationship with mine? And and it's just the technique that I employ in poetry mostly is, I call it Trojan horsing, which is like, I start with a dick joke and then I'm like, by the way, genocide, like, so just so you know, like, audience member, like, you thought this was going to be like a fun little thing, but I'm going to let you know that there's been some actual terrible bullshit that's happened and you are a part of it, brave reader. But the other thing is like how to what you said about like the resilience as well, like that there is a and if there is a trauma, then there is a resilience. If there is a damage, then there is a strength, and it's like and for me, that's the humor. That's like that's the way that the sort of my default, the way that I've always kind of dealt with it, is like the dick joke route followed by the there's blood on your hands, audience member. I had another thing that I wanted to say that it's slowly leaching out of my mind, but it was about trauma and all this other stuff. But I remember, oh God, I remember one time there was this dude at school and I went to college and the college was like really bougie and I had never been around wealthy people before. And somebody asked me about the Whitney Museum and I didn't know what that was. And they were like, how could you not know what the Whitney Museum is? I'm sorry. Maybe if there was like less of my childhood spent trying to avoid people pointing guns at me and more time reading magazines like The New Yorker, I would know your bullshit, but you don't know mine. So anyway, that was just a little anecdote I wanted to share with the room.
I know that we spoke about this a little bit before. And we kind of talked about, like, right when we got on before we went live, was like this idea of COVID affecting our work that we've been doing. Can you guys talk a little bit about that, like some of the struggles that you've faced this year in relation to COVID-19?
Yeah, I think it's hard. It's been in these waves. It's really bad in Oklahoma right now. Yeah, I just feel like every day I get another like text message or Facebook message about somebody who has COVID or somebody who has a family member who has COVID. So we're oh, do I need to refresh something?
You're good.
Oh, okay. 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 Speaking of challenges of COVID,
Yeah.
all the technology. Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm just I'm like perpetually like scared. I'm scared for my parents, like I'm scared for my aunts, like I'm scared for like all the elders in our community that are so vulnerable. And I feel like 2020 has been this weird year where like I cycle, where it's like every time like I'm like, okay, all right, like this is really overwhelming, but like I have a handle on it and like I can cope, and I feel like the ground like shifts underneath my feet again, and then I'm like back to where I'm just feel like really overwhelmed. And so and that's just personally. I feel like it's I feel like it's like a really good, like, I really appreciate those like reminders that people share on social media of like, okay, like you're not like, you're in the middle of a pandemic, and like to give yourself those space. And then I think too, it's like, there's a way that, the people that I don't know. I feel like this happens anytime I go through a hard time, or somebody that I love goes through something hard. And here we all are going through this thing that's kind of hard together. Whereas that, I feel like it's brought me like a lot closer to some people. And there've been some things about that are sad, where like there are people that I care about a lot that I don't like see face to face, but I feel like we're like communicating in other ways, like more regularly. And so like that's been really sustaining. And then I don't know, I feel really lucky to live in a rural place, because when I feel like I'm going to go a little nutso with cabin fever, I just like get in my car and just like get out to like the river or the woods or whatever. And that really helps too.
I'm so jealous. I live in LA and I don't drive. I mean, I moved here from New York one of the reasons I left and went to New York is because I needed to be in a place where I didn't have to drive anymore, because I'm terrible at it. Although I do have my license, like my driver's test, I almost hit a biker. I didn't know any of my turn signals. Like I just failed it completely. And the person was so exhausted that they were just like, it was like I was their last test of the day. And they were like, I don't want to do this paperwork. You passed. And I was like, I don't think that's a good idea. And that summer, I knocked somebody's SUV off the freeway. So that was not, just they skidded off. They didn't tumble or anything. Nobody died. It's fine. I didn't kill anybody. But I was like, I can't do this. Like I spent 3 years driving. I didn't get any better at it. It somehow made me both fall asleep and completely anxious. So like, I'm not great at that. So I can't really get out. And I haven't been in the same room as somebody else since my friend left my apartment in March. So that has been a particular challenge of mine, is like I'm a people person. I am an introvert, but I have extroverted tendencies, and I like to share space with people. And I had this apartment in LA where the first time I had like enough space that I could have a dining room table. And so I loved having people over and having dinner parties and stuff like that. And then like, because in New York, I lived in like a shitty 4-bedroom apartment in Bushwick with like 3 other people, and they're all of their significant others and their big dogs. And I just like finally had a place with space. And I think I made this happen. I think I caused this whole pandemic, because like as a touring performer, somebody had to like make my life on the road. I was like, I would just love some time in my own apartment just to stay here and to like, I don't know, maybe learn how to like live with plants or something. And now that's been my life since March. So like, here's one of my little bundles of joy, and here's one of my little bundles of joy. And I was always so scared to get plants because I knew I had to travel so much, I would just end up killing them. They're all there too. So I'm sorry that I made this pandemic happen. I forgot what the question was.
No, you totally answered it. It was basically just about COVID. So that's great. So what else, like what can we look forward to from you guys? Like you guys are amazing creators. What do you guys have coming up here soon?
So there's going to be a second season of This Land coming out. So spring 2021, late spring, early summer. So stay tuned and check it out. We're in the middle of working on it right now.
Thankfully, in March when all of my gigs started drying up and then my roommate left and went back to New York, I had like suddenly no income and double the rent. And I was like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And then I got a job working for TV, on a show that's like the first all Native American writers room in the history of Hollywood. And so like, now I have like, so there's that, like, that's, if we get to make this show, it's going to be the best thing ever. I'm so excited about it. And like, I also like have written a couple of pilots and like a feature, and just like taking meetings and like trying to get new staff jobs, just because like I want to learn how to do this. I had no aspirations of being in television ever. It's just like the showrunner and the creator had read my feature script and liked that and had met me and kind of knew that I would bring something to the room. So now I have this whole other career that I didn't think was ever possible. So like that's really cool. But I'm just like excited to like have, I mean, it just feels good to have a job, to be honest with you. Like I'm the lucky one, you know, like that's sitting in the privilege or the complete circumstantial luck of having entered this new career at just the right time. You know, I'm so grateful and so excited about what is possible in this new medium.
Yeah, I think that right now is like almost like a podcaster's dream. It's like it's our time to shine. You know what I mean? Because like nobody can hang out with each other. They can only like consume each other through the internet or like media or whatever. So like I'm excited to see just like what kinds of projects I can jump on to create community connection through media during this time, because everyone's just like social distance.
It also felt like in the early pandemic, what I was hearing from my producer, that podcast numbers were going down and then they kind of rebounded. And I think partially because like sometimes you want to consume something that's not on a screen, you know?
Yeah.
Like sometimes you want to be able to do what you do in the world and also be entertained. And I think that because I listen to podcasts a lot more now because my work is on this, you know, like I do work on this Zoom or whatever, we're like on this visual medium. And so when I'm done with that, like, I don't want to watch a movie. Like, I don't want to watch a TV show. Like, I want to like scrub the floors and listen to somebody interview somebody for 2.5 hours. Like,
yeah, I hear that. I feel that so hard. There's something about podcasting that just really connects with people in a way that like it could be like a podcast episode about like complete shit, but as long as there's one little gold nugget in there, like people are like just obsessed about it. And they're like, you got to listen to this podcast episode because it's so good because of this one tiny like little gold nugget that just comes up in like 2 hours, 30 minutes in.
do you ever feel that like people, because this is such an intimate medium and because we're like in people's ears and because largely, and this before pandemic, like this is a medium that people digest individually. Like, I think rarely do people just get together to listen to podcasts, like sit in front of the radio, you know? Do you find that people intuit a relationship with you that you don't have with them? That like they feel comfortable with you or they think they know you or they assume, you know, because it is intimate and because like you are with them in very intimate ways that like there's a relationship that's like one-sided?
Yes, I have been feeling that way lately, especially because like after my whole spiritual awakening in Nome, and I like was open to talking about like mental health stuff after that, because I was just like telling people about my experience and going through that, you know, whole thing on my trip. People were just opening up to me, and it was like, how do you trust me to like, you know, tell me about your mental health? And like, how I'm not a professional, you know, but I was just so open about it. And yeah, I do get that feeling sometimes. I'm just like, whoa, I don't even know your name, you know, but you're like opening up so much to me. And I love it. I appreciate it. It sometimes shocks me at how open people are with me. I guess, yeah, I think that there's like some kind of trust that is built when it is like you said, an intimate connection.
Yeah, it's like having a one-on-one conversation with somebody. Yeah, it's like where you're right in their ear, which is something that I love about it, because I feel like it's so, like when I write for the page, or more often than not like the screen, like, you know, stuff people read online, I just feel like there's like more distance than in the podcast, where it's like, you know, people are listening to it. And I think the way that even like, I know like when I hear information, it like just like moves through me in a way that's like really different than when I read it. And yeah, I think there's something that's like really powerful about that.
It is, but then sometimes like I'll just like be out and somebody be like, "What up, bitch?" And I'm like, "I don't know you like that. Like they're just." I think that in your mind, like we're in the same friend group, and in my mind, I've literally never seen you before. Like,
yeah, it's wild. It's a little bit jarring, I think, but yeah, I still love it too at the same time, because so in the wake of like this whole trip to Nome and everything like that, I came back home and like I made huge changes. Like I separated from my partner and everything. And so like I've been kind of feeling so alone especially during the, the pandemic. And but people have been just so open with me through social media and like totally receptive to everything that I'm going through. And I'm just like, whoa, like I feel connected to people, even though I'm like alone during a pandemic and going through a really hard breakup, so it's an interesting dynamic.
It is a gift, right? It's like, because if somebody feels like they have a connection to you, that means that you've done your job very well. And like, that's kind of the most we can hope for. But then, I'll go on YouTube and I'll watch parts of Kelly Clarkson's talk show. And in my mind, she's my best friend. But, she's there. I'm like, Kelly would be cool with me, though. I feel like we would be cool with each other. I feel like we could hang out, like maybe like, have a glass of wine and like watch a cooking show together. But but I'm never going to ever approach Kelly. If I ever even had the opportunity, it wouldn't be like, what up, Kel? Like, no, that's not my friend. But in my mind.
Yeah, I mean it's wild, but it's funny because it's like this whole. I'm just thinking about that meme. It's like, I love being Indigenous. Shit's dangerous, but it's lit. You know what I mean? Like that's a conversation for me. But I mean, is there anything else that you guys like to add? I mean, we spoke about a wide range of things, but I wanted to leave it open for you guys too. If you'd like to address anything further or mention anything that you think is important to tell folks, all 7 of our viewers.
I would just say I think there's a lot of really great podcasts made by Native folks out there. I really like a lot of the content by CBC, Missing and Murdered. I feel like it's a really, really powerful series by Connie Walker. All My Relations, Indian Collective has a great podcast, and they did actually like a whole series on voting that was super cool. Yeah, so definitely check those other things out. And I think it's like an exciting moment where it's like more and more and more stuff is happening.
To add to that list, there's one called Metsi in Space, and it's like, it's like Native people talking about genre stuff, which I love.
Yeah, I love Toasted Sister by Andy Murphy.
Yes.
I learned about like how just recently you weren't allowed to like have a brewery or a distillery on reservations until like 2019, basically. And this was like a law that was imposed like during Andrew Jackson days. I was like, what? That's wild. So I love that one too. There's a bunch of podcasts popping up in Alaska too, which I'm really excited about, because I think I was the only Alaska Native focused podcast for like the last year or so. But now there's all these other ones, like tiny little ones popping up, and I'm so excited because like selfishly I just want to consume it. I'm like, I want to hear more. I'm trying to teach people to do podcasting so I can just listen to what kind of stories that they want to share and all that stuff. So yeah.
And also anything from Domino Sound. I mean, I'm very biased because they produce both of the podcasts that I do right now. But it's like, I think it's like a woman of color owned, queer owned podcast network, and is I think the first of its kind. So they make a lot of great shows.
What is it called again?
Domino Sound.
Domino Sound. I'm gonna check that out. Okay, well, I wanted to thank you guys. Thank you so much for sitting down with me and thank you for having us. We appreciate it so much, just to kind of pick each other's brains. It's been super fun. My beer is empty, so I'll hand it back to Howie.
Hey, thank you so much. That was a joy to listen to on this side, so I appreciate you guys. What are you doing next week? I'm gonna just do this again. Well, I really appreciate you guys for being on the festival. I'll go ahead and let you get off of the screen, but I appreciate you so much. You're so much fun. I think my song was playing, so we can dance a little bit. Alrighty, thank you. Bye. I'm gonna let you go, Alice. I appreciate you so much. We'll do more things with all of you. My name is Howie Ecclehawk. You've been watching the Indigenous Peoples Festival. That was the Native Creative Podcaster panel, something like that. There are a lot of great Native podcasts out there. Like they said, you should listen to theirs. This Land, season 2 apparently is coming out. Alice's podcast is Coffee and Quaq, and also apparently coming out with Cocktail and Cock. There was a lot of dick jokes and references in this. Just it was great. And speaking of that, Tommy, listen to both of Tommy's podcasts and hopefully watch a show that he's writing. His podcasts are Scream Queen and Food for Thought. That is the end of the Indigenous Peoples Festival. I appreciate you all so much for watching. Please check out our other content, share these videos, and we'll see you soon.